KDK Studios. The Phillies play here. Sports Radio 94, WIP, a radio.com sports station.
Hour in the books, 3 left to play. Jody Mack on a Tuesday night here with you on 94 WIP. Yes, we're still getting all over the Eagles. And we'll do so for the rest of this hour. 12 o'clock, we're going to flip a little bit, get a little Sixer talk in because Kyle Neubeck is going to join us. His compatriot from Philly Voice is on with us now. You also can read him on SI.com and his podcast, Extending the Play, one of the best bird podcasts in town. Johnny McMullen joins me here on 94 WIP. J-Mac, how was your New Year?
Good, Jody. Happy New Year to you.
The same to you, yours, and I hope you had a cocktail because you probably needed one after the Eagle game on Sunday, so hopefully you got started a little earlier on New Year's Eve. All right, let's start with probably an unfair question that I should know the answer to, and I think I've asked you before, but shame on me, my memory stinks now, and I forgot. Home games, have you been going down to the stadium, or are you just doing your writing and Zooming from home, watching it on TV like the rest of us?
No, I've been at all the home games, a few road games, Washington, Pittsburgh, but obviously big-time travel is out the window this year. Yeah, but at the link for all the home games.
Good. When Nate Sudfeld trotted out onto the field, for those who were in the press box with you, not the usual crowded press box to the gills, because COVID does have its effect on who's covering the Eagles and how many are actually there, but you had a good number of compatriots with you. What was the buzz? What was being said? How much of an uproar, and that's my word I'm using, if it was, please tell me if it wasn't, was there in the press box at that time?
I wouldn't say uproar. I mean, I think most knew that Nate was scheduled to play at some point. Doug had sort of let the cat out of the bag to doing some of the pre-TV work. He mentioned Nate was going to get in the game. So it wasn't that big of a surprise. I think the part that changed things a little bit was the fact that the game was so close. And I think that is where things shifted a little bit. I mean, let's be honest. If you're throwing out Matt Pryor at left tackle, Brett Toth at right tackle against Chase Young and Montez Sweat, I mean, Rudy Ford's playing outside corner. To be honest, I think the Eagles kind of thought they'd be down 24-10, maybe at halftime, and then Nate would come in and nobody would blink an eye. So the fact that it was 17-14, they were in the game, the defense was playing so well, despite being so shorthanded. I think that's the part that shifted things, and people thought Doug should have tried to win the game at that point, and he stuck to the original plan, which he claims was his own, and I don't know if I necessarily believe him there, to be honest.
Understood. Most people don't. You did say one thing there. The defense played surprisingly well. Did they really, or does Washington's offense just stink?
Yeah, that's fair. That's possible. And Alex is not healthy. I mentioned, I think on your show, and certainly others, I mean, those calf injuries are generally, once you're out, those are kind of 4-week injuries. So once he was out 2 weeks, probably shouldn't have been playing. Right. And Ron Rivera's already said this week, Taylor Heineke might get some action because he's not completely healthy. So I think that played into it as well. And remember, Terry McLaurin played, Antonio Gibson played, but they didn't practice all week. And if it were Game 6, middle of the season, something like that, those guys probably wouldn't have played. So, and you're right. I mean, even if everybody is healthy, that's not a great offense. So that certainly played into it as well. But on the other hand, I do give that group credit, the defense, and Jim Schwartz's last game with the Eagles. I think that maybe hyped him up a little bit, but I mean, Rudy Ford is a safety and a special teams player, and he's playing outside corner. They had 2 cornerbacks in that game dressed. That's an NFL team, Washington. It's still pretty impressive, I think, what the defense was able to do.
That's fair enough. I thought they were really poor on offense, but you're right. With as many reserves as they had in the lineup and guys with so little experience, you got to give them at least some credit there. Since you went there, and it's probably a story that's being underanalyzed because of everything else that surrounded this last game of the year, how big a loss is Jim Schwartz?
Yeah, I think he's a big loss. I think he's a top 5 defensive coordinator in this league. I think you've seen, coming into the season, I tweeted this out. The Eagles, I don't think people realize this. It's a pretty significant span. It's not a small sample size. You're talking about 2016 to 2019, so you're talking 4 seasons. The Eagles were top 10, number 1 rushing defense, number 1 in the entire NFL over a 4-year span. They were number 2 in third down defense. They were top 10 in red zone defense, top 10 in scoring defense, top 10 in takeaways. I mean, I often talk about this, and this is not a criticism of the Philadelphia fan base, but they're very provincial. I think every local fan base is provincial. In other words, they don't watch other teams. It is really hard to play defense in the modern NFL.
Right.
And if you're top 10 in those important statistics, you're getting the job done. And I don't think enough people recognized it. And then, other than the defensive line, which has always been well-stocked, and that's how the Eagles build, and that's how Jim builds, and you have Fletcher Cox and Brandon Graham, and they've been always good on the defensive line. The back 7, for the majority of his time here, yeah, you had Malcolm Jenkins, you had Jordan Hicks, and then at least Nigel Bradham, some veterans. Wasn't great compared to other teams, the back 7. So I think the result was always greater than the sum of its parts, and that to me says good coach.
Agreed. And the funny thing about it is, and I've been in town a little longer than you, so I go back to Buddy Ryan. His last year, as my first year in town, was his last year as a head coach. And there were fans in this town that wanted to build a statue to him, even though he never won a playoff game. But you go from Buddy Ryan to Bud Carson to Jim Johnson, and all 3 of those guys were uber-aggressive defensive coaches. And Schwartz never was. He played his style of defense, and he wasn't going to change, and they drafted players to fit his type of style of defense. But the fan base, at least those that I relate with over the last 30 years, want to see blood, guts, send a house, kill the other team's quarterback. And that was never Schwartz's way of doing things, and that's why I think some people underestimate actually what he got accomplished during his 4 years here.
No, and I think you bring up, it was a different game when Buddy was here. It was a different game when Bud was, it was a different game. You go back 10 years, you go back 15 years, it was a different game. You can't dominate on defense like you could back then. You just can't. And you see it with the quarterbacks. I mean, most notably Tom Brady, Drew Brees. I mean, these are 40-year-old guys. Could you imagine them playing in 1985 when Buddy was with the Bears? Those guys would have been killed. They couldn't. I mean, that's how drastically the NFL has shifted for a number of reasons. A lot of them safety related. You just have to go about it a different way. And then the second part, I think, is also, if you want to go back to another oldie, Jim Washburn and the wide 9. People in this town hate the wide 9 because of Jim Washburn. Now, a lot of people think it's a defense. It's not a defense. It's a technique for defensive linemen. But Jim believes in it. It's been very successful for this organization, but sometimes things like that are tough for fans to get over.
We're talking to my buddy Johnny Mack from Philly Voice and SI. John McMullen here with us on 94 WIP. All right, we need to get to the quarterbacks. My personal opinion is that the information that has been coming out over the last several weeks, mostly on a national basis, but some with other local people reporting it at around the same time or confirming it, that have been out there about Carson Wentz, that he wants to be traded, that his relationship is fractured with both the Eagles and Doug Pederson. And then a report today that comes out from Associated Press, Rob Motti, that says Carson needs some time to think about his relationship with the Eagles and hopes it doesn't have to end in a divorce. It's kind of conflicting. The reports are changing a little bit, and I don't know where these reports are coming from. I can give you my opinion. I think it's all been Carson Wentz and or Carson Wentz's camp. I don't think the Eagles have contributed to this. Anytime you've got a situation, it's the team, it's the coach, it's the player. It can be a lot of different places where a thought process is coming from. I thought all along it was Carson Wentz. Do you have any ideas, assumptions on where these reports are coming from, and what do you read into them?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you 100% it's not from the Eagles side, any of it. So, the Chris Mortensen stuff, that's Carson's camp, that's his agents. That's sort of how you do things in this league. And then, Rob's very close to Carson. Rob's a good friend of mine. Rob's very religious. He and Carson have a lot in common from that perspective. So that's coming from Carson's camp, very close to Carson. And sometimes, it's the agent's job to do the best they can for their client. And I do think that Carson would not mind leaving Philadelphia and starting anew somewhere else. However, there are significant, we've mentioned on the show, I've mentioned it with you, I'm sure you know, there are significant hurdles to moving him. Not that they can't be overcome, anything can be overcome, but there are significant hurdles. And from the Eagles' perspective, you not only have to get over those hurdles, but you also want to get some value in return. And remember, this is a guy who's coming off a terrible season. It was benched for a rookie quarterback, and it hasn't played for a month. It's not exactly selling high. So I think everyone looks at this and says the more likely scenario is that Carson's going to be back with the Philadelphia Eagles, and he'll be given one more chance to seize this job. And I think at some point he's probably going to come to those same kind of grips, and I think we're in the process of that.
So if you feel the same way I do, which you just said you do, that all these reports have come from the Carson Wentz side, not the Eagles side, why do you about face today? Because it had been wants to be traded, desire to be traded, fractured relationship. Boom, today it was through Rob Motti. Well, he hopes that it doesn't have to end in a divorce. He needs some time yet to think and hopes it doesn't end in a divorce. That's pretty much a 180 in my book. Why the change?
Well, I think it's coming from two different people. Again, the agents have a different sort of look at this. And again, they're trying to do the best for their clients. And probably the best way to go about it is to make sure the Eagles understand that the best scenario from their perspective is probably a new start somewhere else. And then from closer to Carson's perspective, I mean, remember, he's a guy who has done a lot for the community, does a lot off the field as well. I don't think he necessarily says, okay, I'm done with Philadelphia. It hasn't meant anything to me. So I think it's more emotional as you get closer to him than it is for the agent. So I think ultimately everybody will get on the same page, and I think a lot of it comes down, by the way, we haven't even mentioned this, Jody. I think a lot of it comes down from the Eagles' perspective and how they evaluate the player. I mean, the one thing, if the Eagles say to themselves, you know what, I don't think we can salvage him. I think he's too far gone as a player. Then everybody gets on the same page. And that page is moving on and trying to get Carson a second opportunity somewhere else. So I think the Eagles will get involved in this as well, and their evaluation will have a lot to do with it.
All right, so there had been speculation. You, me, everybody else who covers the Eagles, any Eagle fan in town had good-natured speculation on the Eagles making changes off this god-awful season they had, and one of them was Doug Pederson, not back as the head coach. We found out right before Game 17 that he would be coming back, and we've heard absolutely nothing for 2 days since, so we're all assuming he's perfectly fine staying on as the coach. Does that help in Carson Wentz staying here, or does that hurt in Carson Wentz staying here? What do you read into the retaining of Doug Pederson and how it plays in the Eagles' evaluation of Carson Wentz, the football player, like you were just discussing?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the short term it probably hurts a little bit. I think the emotion of it, look, Carson, it's just common sense. Obviously, he wasn't happy he was benched, and Doug benched him. And I think he did feel, like Doug maybe wasn't loyal. But I do think at some point you have to understand this is a business, I think. And I've argued that essentially Carson benched himself. Doug probably lasted longer than most coaches would have lasted. So ultimately that emotional stuff and similar to Miles today on WIP, I think that kind of stuff goes away. I don't think it has a long shelf life. So they have a long history together. And, you're married, Jody. I'm married. And sometimes you fight, but you get over it. I think that won't have a big of an impact. I think the biggest impact is the Eagles' evaluation of the player, and I think ultimately they're going to default to if Lane Johnson was healthy, if Brandon Brooks was healthy, if Jason's there, if Isaac Seumalo didn't miss 8 games, if Andre Dillard was there, Carson wouldn't have had this great regression. That's ultimately my guess. And that's where it starts moving in the direction of he'll be back and be given another opportunity.
Okay. If they're going to trade Carson Wentz, which you're suggesting you don't think you're not discounting it as a possibility, but you're saying it's not a probability, you got to go yay, nay, you think Carson's coming back. I lean toward Carson being traded, or at least that would be if they gave me Howie Roseman's job, I would advise Jeff Lurie, here's what I want to try and do. I'd rather move on. But that's me. So you and I see it a little bit differently. That's perfectly fine. If they're going to move him, they need to move him depending on reworking of contracts. And I've read every article that everybody's put out about what they could do, what Carson might be willing to. It's all just guesswork at this point, so I can't put any weight on it until I know exactly what he is willing to do, if anything. They're going to want to do it before the third day of the year because that's when the $10 million bonus gets paid. So there are some time restraints on this. They did improve their draft status with the loss the other night. And they are picking number 6. And there are some talented quarterbacks in this draft. And Jalen Hurts did finish up 1-3. If you are leaning toward Carson Wentz being somewhere else and they can get a decent return in trade for him, will the Eagles actually think about taking a quarterback at number 6?
Well, they have to if they decide to move on from Carson Wentz. You don't have to take a quarterback, but you have to consider it. I don't think they go into next season and say, oh, Jalen Hurts is the starting quarterback. He proved that. I mean, I think he got progressively worse. Part of that, he had his worst game against Washington. Part of that had to do, as I mentioned, with Pryor and Cobb trying to block Chase Young and Montez Sweat. It just wasn't going to work. So some of that is understandable. And he showed a lot of good signs that he could be a starting quarterback in this league, but I don't think you can default to that. So there's got to be some kind of competition. And I go back to Howie Roseman when he drafted Carson Wentz and when he traded up twice to get Carson Wentz. What he said is, we don't plan on being up this high very often, and what you have to take advantage of it when you're there. And he was talking about the quarterback position. So if they don't have a quarterback, and if they trade Carson Wentz, and somebody like Justin Fields is there at 6, you got to seriously consider it.
That's what I said earlier. If Justin Fields is there. Have you gotten a chance to either watch breakdown film or solicit college advisor you have, a guy whose opinion you trust on Zach Wilson? I think people have elevated him just a little too quickly. I saw his first couple games of the season. I said, wow, this kid looks like a pro. And he just kept going from going back to school for his senior year to, hey, he could actually be drafted, to, hey, he could actually be drafted on the second day, to, hey, he could actually be a first rounder. And now they're talking about him going number 2 to the Jets. And I'm sorry, he just didn't improve that much over the course of the year. But some people do think.
Quick, Jody.
Yeah, I understand.
I will say, I have not. I haven't gotten into the draft in my prep work, but the scouts in the league I talked to, the NFL people think very highly of Zach Wilson. He's higher in most of their minds than Justin Fields, which I think has to do, I always argue, you never scout highlights, you never scout the helmet. That's what NFL people tell me. If anything, look at the bad plays and look at how they respond to that. And obviously Justin was so good in the semifinal. I think people exploded, but he's very raw. People look at, I think Zach Wilson more, Justin Herbert would be a good example that NFL scouts thought a little bit more of him maybe than so-called draft Twitter, as I like to call it. But yeah, there's no question, right? It's going to be Trevor Lawrence. It's going to be Zach Wilson as far as 1-2 quarterbacks, I think, in this draft.
Oh, I disagree with you. I think that if the quarterback of Ohio State goes out and beats Alabama this week, if what he did in his last game, by outplaying Trevor Lawrence, by the way, didn't open up enough NFL scouts, general managers' eyes, he will do so next Monday night, and I think the whole discussion will be over. I think the discussion is ludicrous to begin with. I think Fields is unquestionably the second-best quarterback and the second-best player in the draft. If he drops down to number 6, the Eagles will.
It's not. I will say, as you know, Jody, it's not quarterback versus quarterback. Like Trevor is, say what you want. I mean, people have been telling me for years Trevor is the best prospect since Andrew Luck.
Right.
And Andrew Luck was probably the best one since, maybe going back to
Peyton.
You got to go all the way back to Peyton Manning.
Yep.
But that's what they think of Trevor Lawrence. So. I mean, that doesn't mean you're going to be a superstar in every game against every team, and sometimes things don't work out. But that doesn't change how guys view him as far as the scouting community goes. I don't think anyone look, when you're talking about a guy as a potential top 10 pick, they like Justin Fields. They just think he's a little bit of a work in progress. He hasn't played a lot. I think if you look at sort of the modern environments and dual threats, there's a lot of things to work with there. But I do think there's going to be some growing pains at this level, and that happens with every young quarterback. But I think most scouts feel a little bit more comfortable with a more finished product, and I think that's where they kind of default to.
All right, a couple quickies, and you and I got off on a tangent that I didn't even know we were going to get off on, but it was a good tangent just the same. Top candidate to replace Schwartz, it's not going to be anyone on the staff, is it? They're going to go out and get someone who's an established defensive coordinator, are they not?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, first off, I mean, people like names, obviously, and, Wade Phillips. I mean, Wade's 73 years old. I'm old. I'm not going to play the age card. But I don't think the Eagles and what Jeffrey Lurie thinks himself as a forward thinker, I think he would want sort of a young gun flavor of the month if they were going outside the building. Somebody like Dan Quinn, you mentioned Jim Schwartz and why fans didn't embrace him. Well, they might know that name, but, Dan's going to play a lot of cover 3, and Eagles fans aren't going to like that. So here's how I've explained it. If it's truly the Eagles have framed this as Jim letting his contract expire, he's going to contemplate retirement. If that's truly the way this went, then I think you just elevate Matt Burke to be the next defensive coordinator. He was the coordinator in Miami. He's very close to Jim. You move on with the same system. If this was a scapegoating thing and the Eagles were just letting him go out on his own, then I think they go outside the building.
Okay, that will be very interesting. Anything going to happen in the next week of interest? We now got the season done. Schwartz walked away. The coach is in place. The general manager's not going anywhere. We got a couple of weeks of playoffs. You don't think anything drastic is going to happen within the Eagles for the next couple of weeks, do you?
Are you kidding me? The Philadelphia Eagles? This is a soap opera, Jody. I mean, they started their meetings, their evaluations. You're going to have some coaches fired. I don't think there's any question about that. Maybe on both sides of the football, as I just said, with the defense, if the scapegoating was really Jim Schwartz, maybe even Dave Phipp, the special teams coordinator. So there's going to be some changes there.
Yeah.
And then, they're going to start those evaluations. And I think they're going to make up their minds pretty quickly about whether they want to repair things with Carson Wentz. So you're going to see continued whispers about that story until the bitter end.
Well, if that's the case, it's good news for me because then I'm going to put a call in on Tuesday next week to say, do you want to hop on with me, J-Mac, tonight at 11 o'clock if there is specific...
the NFL, Jody, it never ends, man. That's one thing about this league. They've set up the calendar brilliantly. It goes right from the playoffs to the Senior Bowl, the Combine, free agency, the draft. It never ends.
And even in this very difficult year in which we all had to live, the NFL lived through it better than anybody else because their only real downtime was the worst time during the breakout of the coronavirus. So they've gotten all the way through their season, the regular season. I haven't mentioned this yet, but I feel so bad that Philly guy, coach of the Cleveland Browns, not going to be able to coach their first playoff appearance in almost 2 decades. And Stefanski goes down with COVID. I feel so badly for him. But the NFL itself is going on with the playoffs. They got all their regular season games. They only had suspended games, no canceled games. They actually did it right. So you got to give them the tip of that cap because they do know how to run their business. And you and I will discuss their business even during the offseason. I thank you very much for hopping on with me basically every week this year during the Eagles year. It was my pleasure. Thanks for the great insight, J-Mac.
Hey, thank you, Jody. Appreciate it.
John McMullen, PhillyVoice.si.com, and his Extending the Play podcast can be gotten where you get all your better podcasts. I would call it a must-listen for Eagle fans. Jody Mack hanging with you on 94 WIP. Went long with J-Mac. We'll